You're just in time to hear about one of the greatest stories in NFL history. A team from New England that had many firsts to its name. It's the Providence Steamroller, and Greg Tranter, the author, has written a new book on them, and he's coming up next to tell us all about it.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history, and welcome to another edition where we get to bring in an author and talk about some good old-time football and one of my favorite eras of football, the 1920s era is really where we're going to be focused in. We have our friend, historian and author Greg Tranter here to talk about his new book called The Providence Steamroller, New England's First NFL Team. Greg, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Hey, Darren. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here.
Yeah, Greg, you've wrote a lot of books, a lot of them have a Western New York flavor to them. And this one, is on the other side of the state, actually out of the state and, a different state. But what made you want to write about the Providence Steamroller?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. I did some work at the International Tennis Hall of Fame back about 5 or 6 years ago. And I met the executive director there, a guy named Doug Stark. And Doug lives in Providence, grew up there, been there his whole life. Big Providence sports fan. And he asked me a question about why did so many Providence teams have the Steamroller nickname? Because there's actually 6 different teams over the course of time that have had that as a nickname. And I said, I have no idea. But I said, I knew a little bit about the NFL team, but not too much. So I started researching it. And the more research I did, the more interesting it became. But I then focused on the NFL team. And I came back to him and I said, hey, Doug, this is a really interesting story. I'm going to keep digging. I might write a book about this. And I did. I kept digging. And then I came back to him. I said, hey, if you'll support me and help me like navigate the Providence world, then I'll write the book. And he goes, oh, yeah, no, you definitely have my support. And then what was interesting, because that research I had really just done online, like I was just scrolling through newspapers.com and, doing some Google searches. Well, then I went to the Rhode Island Historical Society, come to find out that the Rhode Island Historical Society had the personal papers of one of the owners and the assistant general manager. So the amount of information that the Rhode Island Historical Society had about the team was stuff that you wouldn't find anywhere, like salaries, how much revenue they were making per game, things like that, is just gold for a researcher like me. So then it was like, oh, I have to write this story. It's just very interesting and too cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess you answered one of my other questions because, in reading the book, it's a great book, great story. And I don't know if I've ever read that much about the Steamroller. Of course, walking through the Canton at the Hall of Fame, you have to see the banner up and they have some little things here and there to talk about the Steamroller. But, nothing like this that tell, I didn't realize that some of the famous players that played for the team, that was kind of interesting, so kind of cool, which we'll get into in just a second. But the salaries and the revenues from the gates, like you're talking about, I mean, you're telling us like right down to the penny for some of these games, and I'm like going, wow, that's some numbers. He's got some sources there, so it's good to hear that you had that resource.
Yes, yeah, and then I went to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and they had some other information that they had, been donated to them over time too. So between the two of them, it was just like, and the other interesting part too is, and we'll get into this, part of it is because the Providence Journal sports editor was the founder of the team. They had a beat writer that followed the team, which no teams had beat writers back in the 20s. But Providence had a beat writer every game. And so every game, there's a large article written in the Providence Journal about the team, kind of like what you would get today, which, was unheard of back then.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's definitely pretty cool. Well, since you alluded to a little bit, why don't you tell us a little bit of how the team was founded and some of the key players?
Yeah, so interesting. So it actually started in 1916. And there was a guy named Pierce Johnson. And Pierce was a schoolboy reporter for the Providence Journal. And he went to a semi-professional football game in Rhode Island, not in Providence, but in the state, on a Sunday, and went to the game. And there was like 3 or 4 thousand people there. And he got the idea that, geez, Providence should have a team because they would draw better than, some place else in Rhode Island. So he went to his boss, who's a guy named Charles Coppin, who was the sports editor of the Providence Journal. And he told him, he said, you should start a team. And
Mhm.
so Coppin did. And he brought in two other guys into his ownership, a guy named James Dooley, who was a state legislator and attorney. And so he brought him into the ownership group. And then he brought in a guy named Peter Laudati, who was kind of a sports promoter, real estate developer. And ultimately, Laudati ended up building two stadiums that the Steamroller played in. Um, but so those three guys were the core ownership group. And
Well,
in
what a great
1960,
triumvirate, Yeah,
right,
you have a guy from the media, a guy that's a sports, promoter, and guy with money in politics. That's kind
right.
of a you can't lose with that.
No, and the interesting part about James Dooley, he ended up as a state legislator founding parimutuel betting in Rhode Island, and
Wow.
ended up running Narragansett Racetrack, which was one of the most famous racetracks from like the 30s to the 60s. And he was the guy behind all that, which is, of course, a whole side story, but just kind of an interesting. So these guys were three sportsmen, right? They were all very interested in sports.
It,
And so that was really formed the core of the management group. And they started out as an independent professional team. They weren't a semi-pro team. They were a pro team. Every player was paid. And they played a schedule all across New England from 1916 through 1924. And as they evolved, their schedule got more difficult. They played better teams. And then in 1923, they were one of the best teams in New England, and they started to think about and approach the NFL about potentially joining the NFL. And to prove to the NFL that they were worthy, in 1924, they scheduled 6 NFL teams as part of their schedule. And of the 6 games, they won 3 of them, tied one, and then lost 2 games. And the 2 games they lost was to the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, who were the third best team in the NFL that year. And they drew well. So the NFL was like, yep, okay, you guys are ready. And so they joined the NFL on August 1st, 1925 to play in 1925 as part of the NFL.
yeah, it's kind of interesting. They're part of that shift in the NFL to the East Coast, and you know, they have 4 teams that were pretty powerful within 23 to 25 between, Frankfurt coming a little bit earlier, but,
Yeah,
Pottsville and Providence and the New York Giants coming in that 25 season. And they had, if you count Pottsville having the best record in 25, you have, 4 NFL champions in a 5-year span from those teams coming up. So
right.
kind of quite a surge of power in the East into the NFL.
Well, and Providence was kind of, what a lot of people don't realize is it was a very wealthy community back in the 1920s, because it was industrialized. It was one of the first cities in the East Coast to really industrialize. And so it had some major manufacturers, and it was one of the wealthiest cities in the country. And this was when the NFL was starting to move to bigger cities, more, financially strong cities. As you said, they joined the same year as the New York Giants, joined the NFL. And in fact, their first win at their new stadium was against the New York Giants. Um, so yeah, so I mean, it's very interesting how that how they got a franchise, and that all played out for them.
And it seems, with you just giving us information on one of the ownership having some parimutuel and the horse racing connections. There's a lot of that going on in the ownership there in the mid 20s and through the early 30s. The Maras, you know, Dooleys, later on the Rooneys, having
Oh
all
yeah.
these horse and track connections.
Well, and then the other thing too that was big is bicycle racing was very big at the time. And actually, the stadium that Law Daddy built called the Cycledrome, which is where Providence played as an NFL team, that was built as a bicycle track, and then they modified it to accommodate the NFL team. And it actually was a significant home field advantage for Providence because the stadium was very tight to the field. In fact, there were places on the field that if you got tackled on the sideline, you fell into the stands. And the end zones were only 5 yards deep instead of 10 because of the curvature of the track. So, it was a 12,000 seat stadium and everybody was like on top of the field. It was very close. And so it was very intimidating for, opposing teams to come in and play.
Yeah, and you have a great image that you got, I believe, from the Pro Football Hall of Fame in your book of the Cyclodrome. I don't think there's very many images of the Cyclodrome, especially with a football game going on, and
Right.
that's got to
Right.
be
There's
pretty
not.
rare.
Yeah, that's true. It was actually, other than that photo, it was really hard to find because I was trying to find, other parts where you were sitting in the stands looking at the field, and they didn't really have much of that I could find. I do have a couple of good action photos from games, one against the Yellow Jackets actually, but yeah, they were pretty tough to find.
Yeah, you would think being because even back then that was kind of a unique thing, like you said, having a football stadium inside of a banked oval bicycle racetrack in all wood, which
Right. And
kind
they
of
were the first team to do that. And there was only one other team. The following year, 1926, Hartford had a team and they played in a bicycle arena too. But they only lasted 1 year in the NFL.
oh wow. So very, very cool. Okay, so they're at the point where you're good enough and coming into the NFL. And why don't you tell us some of the folks who got involved with it and how they did those first couple years.
Yeah. So in 1925, they were actually, they weren't your typical expansion team where, they were starting from scratch. A number of the players that played for the 24 team also played for the 1925 team. And the real pipeline of talent came from Brown University. And people think of Brown today as like, well, Brown's not a very good football program. Well, back in the teens and 20s, they were a powerhouse. I mean, they played in a Rose Bowl.
Mhm.
They had the Iron Men. They were an undefeated team 1 year. I mean, they were a very, very good program. And so, like Curly Oden, who was their quarterback, which is a little different than the quarterback today, was more of a runner, really more of a
Mhm.
halfback. He scored 10 touchdowns in their second season. He was, a very good player. And so there was a number of players, John Spellman, who was a lineman, who was an all-pro. So there was a number of players that came from Brown, 18 in all in the course of their existence, and 13 of those Brown players are in the Brown Athletic Hall of Fame. So they drew, the best of the best, if you will, and most of the players actually were local to New England. Um, and then, they started to go beyond that to some degree, and they did recruit players beyond that. But of course, if you think of it back then, where were they going to live? And they didn't make enough money to have a house in Providence and their regular house some other place. So Pierce Johnson, who was the assistant general manager, his mother housed like 7 or 8 of the players and treated them like they were her kids, right? She did their laundry, fed them, made their beds, the whole 9 yards, right? Um, because they had to have inexpensive housing to stay in Providence to play for the team.
Yeah, and your fond references to Mrs. Johnson. There was a couple times as I'm reading the book, I'm like, that sounds like someplace I'd like to go live. That sounds, this lady's really taking good care of these guys that are playing ball. So that's
Right, right. No, no, for sure.
very hospitable.
Yeah. So their first season, was relatively good. They finished over 500. They were middle of the pack as far as the league. At that time, the league had 20 teams in 1925. And so they were a decent team. The highlight of the season was near the end of the year. Um, they played the first ever NFL game in Boston. And they played the Chicago Bears. Well, 1925 was the year that of the Red Grange tour. And the Steamroller was the seventh game of the tour. And it was played in Boston. Um, and a couple of the interesting footnotes in the book is when Red Grange comes, he meets up with Joseph P. Kennedy because Kennedy owned a film company and he was doing a film on Grange. So before the game, Grange meets up with him. Well, this is Joseph P. Kennedy. His kids are John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And of course, at
Right.
the time, JFK was like 8 years old and Robert Kennedy was like, I think like 3 months old. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And then when Grange is on the sideline before the game, who comes down to greet him but Babe Ruth? And the two
Wow.
guys end up talking for, I don't know, 15 minutes or so before the game. Well, at the time, they were the two biggest names in sports.
Right.
So kind of interesting. But then you get to the game, and the Steamroller actually pulls a major upset and beats the Bears. It's the Bears' first loss on the Grange tour. Um, and they beat him 9-6 in an upset in front of 18,000 fans at Boston Braves Field. So it was the National Baseball League's Boston Braves. That's where they played the game because they decided to move it from Providence because they could sell more tickets and get a bigger crowd, which is why they ended up playing the game in Boston. But it was the first ever NFL game played in the city of Boston.
Wow.
Well, and as part of that, the Steamroller loaded up their team. So Fritz Pollard, who was a Brown alumni and a future Hall of Famer, he was playing for the Akron Pros. Well, Akron's season ended before the Steamroller season. So he signed on with the Steamroller to play their last four games, of which one was the Bears game. And the Steamroller also signed two of the Notre Dame Four Horsemen
See.
to try to load up their team so they could compete with the Bears. Well, as it turns out, none of those three players really had a big impact on the game. But I'm sure they helped a little bit, but none of them had like a great game or anything. But it just goes to show you like how the league played in those days. Like players jumped from team to team and were available. And so they went out and got them to try to bolster the club to beat the Bears. And of course they did beat the Bears.
Yeah. So okay, so I mean having the talent in the backfield is enormous in football history for those games, with Pollard and you have some of the Four Horsemen, Odin in there. And later on they have some superstars playing in some later teams too. Now, what kind of offense did they run? Did they run like the Notre Dame box or they run like
Yes.
a single wing? Okay.
Yeah, they ran both of those, but as I'm sure you know, it was not an offensive game in those days. Like the NFL champions were averaging 12 or 13 points a game. Um, it was very seldom that teams would score more than 20 points. So it was very much a defensive game. It was a punting game. It was a field position game. And actually, some of the interesting points that I discovered as I did my research is, of course, the NFL game had different rules then too. One of the more significant ones was in the passing game, you had to be 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage to pass the ball. And if you threw an incomplete pass in the end zone, you lost possession of the ball. It was like an
Mhm.
interception. The other team
Yeah.
got the ball. So you were, discouraged from, passing the ball a lot unless you were like behind, right?
Right.
Um, and then the other interesting thing is, and this just goes to show you how much of a defensive game it was, is if you scored, you could request to receive the kickoff. So so you had a chance to catch up, right? But many times the team didn't. Like today, if you had the chance to receive the ball again, of course you would receive the ball again. But
Right.
not in those days. It was like it was a field position game. And so the punting and the punter became really important. And a lot of times they would punt on second or third down, and not even use up the full three downs to get a first down.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, you talk about, the defense. These Providence teams. I don't think, I mean, I read a lot of football books and I read a lot of books on teams from this era. I don't know if I've ever read of a team stifling so many drives inside, what we would call today the red zone than Providence did. It seemed like every game they had like three or four times they're stumping whoever, and it's a close game, and they're stopping them like the 10-yard line or the
yeah.
16-yard line or something like that. It's amazing that the defense really stepped up. The bend
Yeah,
not
and they were a
break.
very strong defensive team, especially the era where they were the better team, like in, 27, 28, 29. They had, like, I think in 27, I think they had six shutouts. In 28, I think there was only one or two teams that scored more than 10 points against them. So I mean, they were, like in the year they won the championship, they gave up 42 points in, you know, 10 games. So, 4 points a game. Yeah, so they were very strong defensively, and they were led by an interesting character, a guy named Gus Sonnenberg, who was known to be a pretty wild and crazy. He'd be like an Otis Sistrunk or somebody like that if you want to
Mhm.
compare him to a player of, these eras. Just a wild guy who was a professional wrestler, um, and actually won World Wrestling Championships after he ended up retiring after their championship season because he could make more money wrestling than he could playing football, which just, like, oh, really?
Yeah,
Um, so
yeah,
he was an important player and really, fired up the team. He was kind of the heart and soul of their defense for 3 or 4 years.
yeah. I've really gotten to know a lot about him. Some research I'm doing for my current project when he played for Pottsville. So it's
Yes.
for a season. So we're getting to see quite a bit of him, and then reading your aspects of him and what your research says. And it was really kind of interesting too. See what he was later on in life, and some of his attributes he had. So that's
Right.
pretty interesting.
And he was
So
also a kicker for the team.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
He made some critical extra points for the team in some of their close games. So,
Yeah, must have been quite an athlete, that's for sure.
yes.
So speaking of athletes, okay, so we're these early teams, NFL teams of the Steamroller, they're sort of middle of the pack. What was sort of the thing that started to propel them towards the top of the NFL? What
Well, yeah.
some of the
So
activities?
what was really one of the biggest things that propelled them was in 26 and 27, the NFL shrunk by a number of teams. They were down to 12 teams in 1927. So imagine in 25 there was 20. And so they were contracting. Well, those players had places to go. Where were they going to go? Well, where the Steamroller got really fortunate is the Detroit Panthers, who were a team that was founded by Jimmy Conzelman, um, folded after the 27 season, and so the Steamroller went after Conzelman, who was both a player and a coach, and they signed him. Well, Conzelman brought like a half a dozen of the Panthers' best players with him, which is where Sonnenberg came from because he was with Detroit that prior year. And so he brought a number of really good ball players with him. And of course, Councilman himself was a terrific player for at least a few years until he injured his knee. And so that's really when the Steamroller went from like a middle of the pack team to now they were quite good. And so in 1927, they had their best season to that point. and ended the season on I think it was a 3 or 4 game winning streak that boded really well for 1928. Um, and then, in 28, with Konzelman, leading the pack. And then the other thing they signed out of the AFL, because in the AFL in 1926, well, Wildcat Wilson was one of the stars of the AFL. And in fact, many historians put him on comparison to Red Grange, that he was that good of a player from the University of Washington. Well, he also joined up with Konzelman and the Steamroller. So between having Curly Oden, who was a carryover from the 25 and 26 season, and then you add Wildcat Wilson to it, and you add Konzelman, now all of a sudden you have three, terrific weapons. And then they signed two brothers from Boston College, the Cronin brothers, who are also really good running backs and linebackers. Now all of a sudden you have, a terrific team with depth. Um, and so that's really what positioned them, so well in 1928.
Yeah, isn't it? It's I always find it fascinating that college football in 1924, 1925 season, I mean, had such a plethora of talented halfbacks and runners.
Yeah.
Grange, Wildcat Wilson, Ernie Nevers, the four horsemen all had
Oh yeah,
their
right.
skills doing it. And they're all in that within that 2 year period really that they're graduating, and most of them play. Well, I think all of them at some point played pro ball and in the NFL at the same time. So it's really kind of cool that they're matching up in college. Sometimes the Four Horsemen played against Ernie Nevers in the Rose Bowl. Wildcat Wilson's got his share of playing against some big stars in college, and
Yeah.
then you see him facing the NFL and taking their teams to glory at that level too. So that's kind of cool.
Right. And then Brown, I think it was their 26 team, which was the Iron Men. They were undefeated. And several of those players ended up, with the Steamroller as well. Because I didn't really talk about the linemen, which is what they got from Brown primarily, was some terrific, offensive and defensive linemen too. So, oh yeah, no, it was very interesting, and of course made Providence a championship team in 1928.
Yeah, well, so I guess maybe that's you imagine playing the Notre Dame box, and I know you say it's not an offensive thing, but when you have Wildcat Wilson and you have Konzelman and Odin and whoever else you want to throw in there for the other guys, that Notre Dame box is who you don't know in the single wing, sometimes you don't know who's getting the ball from the snap. Uh, Boy, that's got to be put some pressure on a defense, that's for sure.
Right. Oh yeah, no, for sure, right? And it did.
And they all can throw the ball too, by the way.
Right, right. No, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because really their passer was Wildcat Wilson. It wasn't Konzelman. He was more of a receiver in their offense.
And I know you had a couple times you're having the stats, you're having, and just for the listeners to be familiar with what's going on here, there's times where you'd have Wildcat Wilson throwing a couple key plays to a Konzelman or Odin, and then he's like a couple plays later, he's receiving some passes from one of those guys, downfield for a big gain. And it's just kind of, you're thinking, wow, he just threw a big pass, and now he's catching a big play. It's such a reciprocal type offensive structure that they had back then that we're not
Yeah.
used to today.
Yeah, each of the players were multidimensional,
Yeah, very,
right?
very good. Definitely have to have some skill sets there, that's for sure.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so this team's, not to make a pun, but they're rolling. They're really coming on strong here and taking the NFL by storm. So where are they? What's their destiny? What's happening with them in the NFL?
So in 28, they start the season and they actually lose their second game of the year to the Yellow Jackets. They blew a fourth quarter lead and lost to the Yellow Jackets. And that ends up turning out to be their only loss of the season. But they go on a win streak and they get to, oh, I don't know, they're about 2/3 of the way through the season. And the Yellow Jackets were an interesting team because they were at Frankfurt, which was really part of Philadelphia. They were in Pennsylvania, Well, Pennsylvania had blue laws, and you couldn't play football on Sundays. So the Yellow Jackets would play their home games on Saturday, and then they would travel to Providence and play the Steamroller on Sunday. So they had a back-to-back games in the middle of November. And the Steamroller, I think, were 5-1-1 coming into the games, and the Yellow Jackets were 7-1. They were the two top teams in the NFL, and so they were playing a back-to-back games, and it would go a long way in determining, who the championship of the league was. Well, on Saturday, they're in Frankfurt. Place is packed, 15,000 standing room only, and the Yellow Jackets are leading until the fourth quarter, 6-0. And then Wildcat Wilson basically carries the ball 8 consecutive times, drives 65 yards, and ties the game. And they just barely missed the extra point, but the game ends in a 6-6 tie. Then they get on the train and they travel to Providence overnight and play at the Cyclodrome the next day. Cyclodrome's packed. And the Steamroller end up scoring early in the game and go up 6-0 and hang on. Defensively, they played a great game and they end up winning 6-0. And they come out of that game in first place. And of course, in those days, the champion was determined by winning percentage. And so, they were in first place. And so their destiny was in their own control. So the following week, they have the largest crowd in the history of the Cyclodrome to play the Giants, and they beat the Giants. And then they beat Pottsville on Thanksgiving. And then they go into their final game of the season against the Green Bay Packers, and they have to win or tie. So even if they tie, they would win the NFL championship. And the game's at the Cyclodrome. Again, another standing room only crowd. And there's a tragedy that happens 2 days before the game. So the team's all psyched up and the city's all on fire, ready to go for the championship game. And 2 days before, Pierce Johnson's mother goes shopping in the morning because she didn't have enough cereal for her players, for the boys, as she referred to them. Well, anyway, she gets hit and killed by a streetcar. Um, and, her son finds out later, and then of course the players do. Well, it's a devastating blow to the team. And here they are on the verge of playing for, an NFL championship.
It's a gut punch as a reader reading your book too. To get to that point too, you build it up quite nicely, and then you're picturing Mrs. Johnson and bananas and cereal scattered under a streetcar somewhere in Providence. It's
Right,
it's
right.
kind of
And so, they end up playing the game. They started slow. They didn't play their best first half. But they found it in themselves. So Green Bay takes a 7-0 lead early in the game and holds that lead until the fourth quarter. And then again, Wilson and Oden get together and they end up getting a touchdown. And Sonnenberg kicks the extra point to tie the game 7-7, and the game ends in a 7-7 tie. And Providence is the NFL champions. And the fans didn't want to leave, and as the team celebrated on the field. I think I determined as, I described it as a bunch of schoolboys, jumping up and down on the field as their, NFL champions. And then the following day, the 7 players that stayed with the Johnsons were the pallbearers for Mrs. Johnson's funeral, and that was on a Monday. And then Tuesday they had a celebration of the team, a victory banquet, at a hotel in downtown Providence at the Hotel Biltmore,
oh my
and
God.
celebrated the championship.
What an emotional roller coaster for the Pierce family and that team. Those
Yeah.
4 or 5 day cycle there
Oh
of
yeah. And
ups
the,
and
and the
downs.
saddest part is, Pierce Johnson, who was instrumental in the founding of the team, he didn't go to the Green Bay game because he was at the funeral parlor, and then he didn't go to the banquet because he was still mourning the loss of his mom.
Mm.
And here's a guy who, helped get the team started and, was a huge for a long long time was a huge advocate of football in the state of Rhode Island. I mean, he's renowned
Yeah.
for what he did for football in Rhode Island for years and years after the Steamroller was gone.
Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of things, if something like that happened today, especially I mean, let's not forget the game that seals the deal is a tie. Everybody's on the edge of their seat anyway because of this great game going on
Right,
and the consequences of that game and everything else going on. This is like the NFL media would eat that up today. That would be like a dream come true. Not tragedy's a good thing, but just the
right.
storylines are would be through the roof.
Oh yeah, for sure, right? Front page of the of the paper
Yeah.
every day, and oh yeah,
Yeah,
right.
very very dramatic. The whole sequence was
Yeah.
yeah.
And so, they're the first New England team to win a NFL championship. And the interesting thing is they're the last team that no longer exists that won an NFL championship. So
Oh
every
yeah,
team since then still exists. They may not exist in the same city, but they still exist. And so
yeah,
Providence is the last, and there were several teams before them, right? The Yellow Jackets, the Canton Bulldogs, the Akron Pros all won championships, and they don't
right.
exist either. But Providence is the last
The
franchise.
last survivor
Right.
until they
Yeah.
don't exist anymore. Wow, yeah,
Yeah.
that is kind of a neat fact. That's going on 100 years almost for
Right.
that.
Yeah. It's 100. Yeah. Well, and part of the reason I wrote the book and it was released this year is next year is the 100th anniversary of their founding as an NFL
Okay,
franchise, 2025.
yeah, 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 very timely. So
Yeah.
so what happened with Providence? How long did they stay in the NFL and what was
Yeah, so they
after?
were 1929, they had kind of a disappointing season. As I mentioned, Sonnenberg left. They also lost a few other players. Jimmy Konzelman had an injury halfway through the 28th season, a knee injury. He never was the same, even though he played part of 1929. Um, in 29 is known for a couple of significant things that Providence did. They actually broke a record that still exists today, and they had a first. So the record that they broke, they played 4 NFL games in 6 days.
Wow. Jeez.
And part of that was they had a couple postponements because there was a bunch of rain and they had bad weather and stuff, and they didn't want to lose the games, and so they packed them in. Well, one of those 4 games was the first NFL night game ever played, and it was
Hmm.
played at Kinsley Park in Providence.
Oh,
And you brought up the name earlier, Ernie Nevers. They played the Chicago Cardinals, and Ernie Nevers was the star of the game. The Cardinals won 16 to nothing, and he scored all 16 points. Um, but it was considered a success. They played the game at Kinsley Park instead of the Cyclodrome because the Cyclodrome was basically underwater because of rain. And so the playing field was unplayable. So they moved the game to Kinsley Park, which is the park that the independent pro team played in the 20s. They played at Kinsley Park, which held about 6,000. Well, they had a standing room only crowd for the night game. And so that led the Steamroller. They also became the first NFL team to have permanent floodlights in their stadium. Um,
wow.
and so they added those in 1930, and they played 4 more night games in 1930, 40 years before Monday Night Football was ever thought of.
Very cool.
One of the interesting things that came from the night games, in 1930, Tony Latone signed a contract to play for the Steamroller, and it had a stipulation in the contract that for the night games, he only got paid 60% of his normal pay because he had to help pay for the cost of the floodlights. You imagine that telling Patrick Mahomes, hey, you only get 60% of your contract for the night games.
Right. Yeah, we got to pay for the juice on the lights.
Yep. So
Yeah, I can
anyway,
imagine can
that
imagine the
was
players saying, hey, let's play during the day then.
right, right, Um, so then, the team and, then the team was hit by the Depression in 1929. As I mentioned, they were very much an industrial city, so they were hit really hard because of that. And so the Steamroller went from averaging, between 10 and 12,000 fans a game, and now they were down to, like 6,500 in 1930 and then less than 5,000 in 1931. And even though, and so they couldn't invest because, of course, in those days, ticket revenue was everything, right? That was your revenue stream. You didn't have television and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So then they had to invest less in players, so the teams weren't as good. Um, and even though they were never really bad, they were pretty much a 500 team, the last few years they played. And then at the end of the 31 season, I think US unemployment was like 30% at the time. So Providence went to the NFL and said, "Hey, we're going to take a year off. We expect to come back in, a year later." And they played as an independent pro team for 1 year. And they actually played two NFL teams, and there was a team in Boston by then, and they actually beat the Boston team, which was really kind of ironic. That was a pretty big upset, and they lost to the Cardinals, so they were 1-1 against the two NFL teams they played. And then the following year, again, the unemployment wasn't really turning around much, and so they basically, gave their charter back to the league, and that was the end of the Steamroller, and the end of pro football in Providence. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
I don't know if you did it on purpose, but you have quite a few program covers from, I believe, some from your collection, some from other collections around, and they sort of appear through the years and key games and everything. And it's, the first few are, they look like they must have used the same template for the thing, but there's like very little advertising like for the early years. And then you get like they're getting their peak. There's like an advertisement on the top, there's one on the bottom. And at one point for the Great Depression, there's like an advertiser up in the top, and the bottom's like, hey, this space is open for your advertisement or something like that. And then it like
yes,
goes away. There's no advertising on it like the next year. So
right. And of course, those programs were all of like 8 pages and, and stuff. And there's like
yeah.
two pictures in the programs, but they're very cool programs. Um, so of course I have those in the book, and then I have a couple of pocket schedules from 1928 and 1930 that came from the Rhode Island Historical Society collection. So those were pretty
Yeah, and I think one of them had an interesting advertiser on it too. The pocket series. I
right.
forget who it was, like the theater or somebody there had
Yeah.
a. It's kind of
Yeah.
neat. But I guess the other image I gotta talk about, because and this is from your collection, is they gave out a token for winning the championship to each of the players, and you have an image of that. Maybe you could describe that a little
Yeah,
bit.
well they gave out a championship watch to every player that's engraved on the back of, that they were 1928, NFL champions. I can't imagine there's too many of those watches floating around
No.
these days. But yeah, very cool artifact. And then as you had mentioned at the beginning, the Hall of Fame has a huge red pennant of the Steamroller as NFL champions. And then there's also Jimmy Conzelman was the MVP, and they have the MVP trophy. Um, and the Hall of Fame has both of those, which are, of course, very cool artifacts, and
Yeah.
stuff. So just amazing, the stuff that's around and available for the Steamroller. And between the Rhode Island Historical Society and the Pro Football Hall of Fame and my minor collection,
Hmm.
um, between the three of us, I think we have just about every program from the every
Wow.
game they played. It was amazing what the Rhode Island Historical Society and the Hall of Fame have for programs. from those games. Because, I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of those games, there was 5,000 people, 4,000 people.
Do
Um,
do you know who the watch? Do you know who it belonged to? Who received
I
that
do
watch?
not. Yeah, I
No?
don't.
Okay. And if you
Um,
had, you're gonna tell us it's Sonnenberg or somebody,
no.
I took this
No.
right off of Wildcat Wilson's wrist and
Yeah.
in my collection.
No, I think it was like the trainer or something.
Okay.
So no, it wasn't a star player by any means. Um,
But,
so
okay, I guess the other big question is how, I mean, you say it in the book. I know the answer because I read it, but how did the steamroller get their name?
yeah, so it is a really interesting story. So going back to 1916 when they were the independent pro team, they had a couple. They were originally called the Providence Pros, and they played the first couple games known as the Pros, and that's what they were referred to in the Providence Journal. And then it was either the second or third game, and I wasn't able to nail it down specifically, but Charles Coppin, who was the owner, was standing in a concession line, and he overheard two fans in front of him talking about how Providence had played the first half. And the one guy said to the other, Providence was steamrolling the opponent. And Coppin overheard that and was like, "Oh my God, that's a great name. We're going to call him the Steamroller." Well, he was adamant that it was the Steamroller, not plural, singular. And so they were the Steamroller, not the Steamrollers. Um, and I think it was like 10 or 12 days later, the Providence Journal was told, because of course he's the sports editor, that it was the Steamroller and it was always to be the Steamroller. And he was adamant that it was singular. And unless you consider the Tonawanda Cardex a team in the NFL, they played one game. The
Mhm.
Steamroller are really the first team to have a singular nickname. In actually North American sports, not just in football. Now it's,
Oh,
now it's much more prevalent with the Utah Jazz and, teams
right.
with singular nicknames, but they were really the first.
And all of history is thankful to those two guys in the concession line that they didn't say they were knocking the crap out of the team because we could have had a
Yeah,
whole
right.
different name for the Providence team.
Yes. And then the Steamroller name is used. So Pierce Johnson ended up having several minor league football teams from the 30s into the middle 60s, and they all used the Steamroller nickname. And then Providence had one other major league franchise. They had a team at the birth of the NBA, and it was called the Steamrollers. It's plural. But they took the name from the football team. And those are the
Oh,
only two major professional franchises in Providence history.
wow. Now, I told you earlier that when I was reading the book, I'm about halfway through the book, and I'm not one that peeks ahead to see the end or anything. I'm like, boy, okay, he's at the demise of the franchise, and they're closing up shop, and there's still a lot of book left. And to my surprise, I turned the page, and there is this plethora of information that's to football fans that's really gold. Maybe you could describe what's at the back of the book for readers to enjoy.
Yeah, so what I did was I did I'll call it a brief, I guess, biography on every player that played for the Steamroller. So I cover their entire professional career, with statistics from Pro Football Reference, how many games they played, who they played, all that stuff. But along with that, I write a few paragraphs about each player, highlighting anything major they did as part of their football career. If they played for football teams outside the NFL, which most of them did, I'll highlight their college career. And then if I was able to discover it, which I was for most of them, what did they do after their career was over? What kind of, profession did they go into? And there's some pretty amazing stories about some of the, different players and what professions they did. So yeah, so we cover that. So that covers a number of pages. And then I have a whole statistical area that goes into who scored how many points did they score per quarter, their schedules for each year, and their schedules go well beyond what's in Pro Football Reference because Pro Football Reference only has the NFL games they played.
Oh
Well, they
yeah.
played a number of out of league games, for lack of a better term, because as I mentioned, their stream of revenue was ticket sales. So like Providence would take a trip to like Chicago or Green Bay. Well, either on the way out or the way back or both, they would stop in other cities and play games. So yeah, I can remember specifically one where they played Green Bay, and on the way home they stopped in Buffalo and played a team from Buffalo, not an NFL team, just another pro football team. And that was to try to make, extra money for both the players, but also for for the team. And it made the long trip worthwhile because they were playing more than one game.
Yeah. Wow.
Um,
Incredible stuff. Now, is there maybe one or two of those maybe you want to mention, some of the players you have in the back that tell us a little about, or
yeah, let's see. I'm trying to think of some of the better stories. Um,
but
uh,
it doesn't have to be one of the better stories. Just give an example of what you're doing. Just we're here to talk about preserving football history and just talk about some of these players that maybe somebody doesn't know about. To give them a little glimpse of what you have in the back there.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I briefly mentioned, Wildcat Wilson. So, he was a superstar player at the University of Washington. He was an All-American. Then he joined the American Football League in 1926, but they actually named a team after him. It was called the Los Angeles Wildcats. And then, of course, they played Grange a bunch of times because they were almost their standard opponent. Um, and so they played a number of games there. And then, of course, Wildcat, then, when the AFL disbands after the 26th season, he then joins the Steamroller and plays, 4 years for Providence. And then he leaves there and then he goes on to, his own, professional career. And I forget exactly what he did. I think he was a teacher afterwards. But some of the stories,
And
there's
he wrestled a little bit too, right? Isn't
right.
that
Oh yeah,
something?
right.
Yeah,
Thank you for reminding me.
yeah.
Yes, that's right. Along with, Jack Spellman, who was a Brown player who actually played, he was the only player that played all the seasons that the Steamroller were in existence.
Hmm.
Um, and he was an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling in 1924, won the gold medal.
Hmm.
Um, and then Sonnenberg, he taught Sonnenberg how to wrestle, and then Sonnenberg ends up beating him in professional wrestling. And then Wilson becomes a wrestler because there's money to be made, right?
Right.
So yeah, so you uncover some of that, some of those stories, and then there's another Brown player that becomes a major surgeon in Rhode Island, who's nationally renowned as a surgeon. Um, One guy becomes the head of the state police. So there's just some very and then another sad story. A guy named Orrin Pape, who was from I think it was Iowa. He left. He played for the Steamroller for a couple years, and then became a state trooper in Iowa. He was the first state trooper killed in the line of duty.
Hmm.
And there's a bridge named after him in Iowa. Um, and so I actually explained the story of how he was killed, but he was shot. But, he basically did what you would call kind of a standard, pull over a speeder, and the guy pulls a gun on him, and they wrestle, and he shoots him and ends up dying from it. Um,
Hmm.
there's a couple sad stories in there too, but
Eh,
he's forever remembered because there's a bridge that still exists that was named in his honor.
Well, it takes a special story, a special book to preserve some of these people that we would have never heard of, like this officer that was killed that played
Yeah.
pro football, and Mrs. Johnson, and some of the others, so we appreciate you preserving that history and sharing it with us. So, Greg, why don't we take this opportunity? Let's give the name of the book and where folks can get it.
Yeah, sure. So it's called the Providence Steam Roller, New England's first NFL team. It's available online from like all the major like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, Target. It's available at all those places online. It is available in a few independent bookstores in Rhode Island, like Books on the Square, which is in downtown Rhode Island, or downtown Providence, which is a pretty popular bookstore. I'll actually be doing some book signings at Barnes and Noble in December. There's a Barnes and Noble in Smithfield, Rhode Island. I'll be doing a book signing on December 7th. And then there's one in Warwick, Rhode Island on December 13th, which I'll be doing a book signing there too. So yeah. Um, and I think, one of the legacy points that I think I point out, which I think is amazing, at the 1928 championship banquet, a guy named Charles P. Sisson, who was the Attorney General, said this, and I'll quote what he said because I think it's pretty amazing. When you consider back in 1928, baseball was by far the most popular sport in America. Okay.
Right.
And he said, quote, "The type of football you play," speaking to the Steamrollers, "may act as a stimulus to college and younger teams' football. I think the day is coming when pro football, if it follows the examples set by the roller, will take its place with baseball as the great national professional sport."
Wow.
That would have been unheard of in 1928, and that's what
Yeah,
he
it's
said,
quite prophetic.
right?
Yeah.
And so I can argue that the NFL followed the way the roller played, and that's why it's the number one sport in America today.
Yeah, it's surpassing baseball, and
By a lot now,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah,
and college football. So
right, for
yeah,
sure.
tremendous, tremendous. Well, Greg, great story, great topic, and I'm glad you were able to do the research and get from all those different resources that you did and put them all together, and share the images and the stories and the people, and tell us this story right. And very well done. And folks, I highly recommend it. And Greg, we thank you for sharing the story in the book. We thank you for coming on here today and sharing your story with us.
Hey, thanks a lot. Really appreciate the opportunity.